The stagecoach rattled into Idaho City on a scorching August afternoon in 1878, carrying a woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never met. And Teresa Riley stepped down onto the dusty street with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a leather-bound Bible that had belonged to her mother. The mountain air of the Idaho Territory hung thick with the smell of pine and dust, and Teresa felt every eye in the small mining town turn toward her as she stood beside the Wells Fargo depot, her dark hair already escaping from its pins after 3 weeks of bone-rattling travel. She was 22 years old, orphaned and nearly penniless, and the advertisement she had answered 3 months ago was folded carefully in her dress pocket, creased from being read so many times the ink had started to fade. A tall man approached from across the street, his boots kicking up small clouds of dirt with each step. He wore a weather-beaten hat pulled low over his eyes, and his shirt was rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms tanned dark from years in the sun. When he stopped in front of her, he pulled off his hat, and Teresa found herself looking into the weathered face of a man who appeared to be in his late 50s, with gray streaking through his beard and deep lines carved around his eyes. "Miss Riley." His voice was gruff, uncertain. "Yes." Teresa's throat felt dry and the word came out smaller than she intended. "I'm Walter Preston. We have been corresponding." Something cold settled in Teresa's stomach. The letters had been signed W. Preston, and she had assumed, perhaps foolishly, that the man seeking a bride would be closer to her own age. But she had sold everything she owned to make this journey, and there was nothing waiting for her back in Boston, except memories of her parents' death from typhoid fever, and a city that had chewed her up and spit her out when she could no longer afford the rent on their tiny apartment. "It is good to finally meet you," she managed, forcing her voice to remain steady. Walter Preston shifted his weight, looking as uncomfortable as she felt. "I should be honest with you, Miss Riley. The advertisement, it was not exactly for me." Teresa blinked, confusion replacing some of her dread. "I do not understand. It was for my son, Parker." Walter twisted his hat in his hands. "He has been working himself into the ground trying to keep our ranch running, and he needs a wife, needs help. But he is too stubborn and too proud to admit it, so I placed the advertisement without telling him." "You mean he does not know I am coming?" Teresa's voice rose slightly, and several passers-by turned to look. "He knows now. I told him last week when I got your telegram saying when you would arrive." Walter grimaced. He was not pleased, but he will honor the arrangement. "Parker is a good man, Miss Riley, the best I know. He just needs someone, and Lord knows he will never find anyone out here on his own. We are 10 miles outside of town, and he barely leaves the ranch except to sell cattle or buy supplies." Teresa set down her carpetbag and pressed her fingers to her temples. The headache that had been building behind her eyes since Boise now throbbed in earnest. "Mr. Preston, this is highly irregular. I came here in good faith, believing I would be marrying you or at least someone who wanted a wife. I know, and I apologize for the deception, but please just come meet him. If after a week you want to leave, I will personally pay for your passage back to Boston, and I will give you an additional $100 for your trouble." Walter's eyes were earnest, almost pleading. "We are in the middle of harvest season, and Parker is trying to do the work of 3 men by himself. Our hired hand broke his leg last month, and the wheat will rot in the fields if we do not get it cut and threshed soon. I am too old to be much help anymore. My back gives out after an hour of real work." Teresa looked around the street, at the rough wooden buildings and the men who watched her with undisguised curiosity. She had no money for a hotel, no money for passage back east, and no prospects if she returned. At least at the Preston Ranch, she would have food and shelter, even if only temporarily. 1 week, she said finally. I will give this 1 week and then I will make my decision. Relief washed over Walter's face. Thank you, Miss Riley. You will not regret this, I promise you that. The wagon ride out to the Preston Ranch took nearly 2 hours, following a rutted road that climbed into the foothills of the Boise Mountains. Walter tried to make conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the ranch, but Teresa found it hard to focus on his words. Her mind kept circling back to the fact that she was about to meet a man who had not asked for a wife, who probably resented her arrival, and who she would somehow have to convince to marry her if she wanted any kind of future in Idaho territory. The ranch appeared as they crested a ridge, spread out in a valley between 2 pine-covered slopes. A log house with a stone chimney sat near a creek, surrounded by several outbuildings including a large barn, a chicken coop, and what looked like a bunkhouse. Beyond the buildings, golden wheat fields stretched toward the mountains, the grain heavy and ready for harvest. It should have been beautiful, but Teresa could only think about how isolated it was, how far from anything resembling civilization. As Walter pulled the wagon up to the house, a figure emerged from the barn. Even from a distance, Teresa could tell this was Parker Preston. He moved with the easy confidence of a man completely at home in his surroundings, his long legs covering the ground quickly as he approached. He was tall, probably over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean build that spoke of hard physical work. Unlike his father, he wore no hat, and the late afternoon sun caught the light brown of his hair. When he reached the wagon, he looked up at Teresa with eyes the color of creek water, gray-green and unreadable. He appeared to be around 26 or 27, with a strong jaw and a mouth set in a hard line. There was dirt on his shirt and dust on his boots, and he looked every inch the working cowboy his father had described. Miss Riley. His voice was deeper than Walter's, with a slight drawl that suggested years in the West. Welcome to the ranch. There was nothing welcoming in his tone, and Teresa felt her spine stiffen. Mr. Preston, thank you for having me. Apparently, I did not have much choice in the matter. Parker's gaze flicked to his father, and something sharp passed between them. Walter cleared his throat. Son, help Miss Riley with her bag. I am sure she would like to get settled after her long journey. Parker reached up without a word and took Teresa's carpetbag, then offered his hand to help her down from the wagon. His palm was rough with calluses, and his grip was firm but impersonal. The moment her feet touched the ground, he released her hand and stepped back. I will show you to your room, he said. We eat supper at 6. You will have your own space in the house. My father and I will not bother you. Parker, Walter's voice held a note of warning. What? I am being polite. Parker's jaw tightened. I am following your plan, old man. You wanted a woman here to help with the work, and here she is. But do not expect me to play the courting fool. I have a field of wheat that needs cutting before the weather turns, and that is where my attention needs to be. He turned and walked toward the house, carrying Teresa's bag. She followed, her cheeks burning with humiliation and anger. Behind her, she heard Walter sigh heavily, but she did not turn around. The inside of the house was surprisingly clean and well-maintained. The main room held a stone fireplace, a solid wooden table with 4 chairs, and a kitchen area with a cast iron stove. Shelves lined one wall, holding books and a few personal items. 2 doors led off the main room, and Parker pushed open the one on the left. This was my mother's sewing room, he said, setting down the carpetbag. We put a bed in here for you. There is a wash basin on the stand and fresh water in the pitcher. The privy is behind the house about 50 yards. Breakfast is at 5, dinner at noon, supper at 6. Teresa stepped into the small room which held a narrow bed, a simple washstand, and a trunk for storage. A single window looked out over the wheat fields. It was sparse, but it was clean, and it was more than she had expected. "Mr. Preston," she said, turning to face him, "I understand you did not ask for me to come here, and I appreciate that this situation is awkward for both of us. But I have traveled a very long way, and I have nowhere else to go. Your father promised me a week to prove myself. I am asking you to give me that week fairly." Parker studied her for a long moment, and something in his hard expression softened slightly. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you work?" "Real work, I mean, not just sewing and housekeeping." Teresa thought of the months she had spent working in a textile mill after her parents died, standing on her feet for 12 hours a day in the deafening noise and lint-filled air, her fingers bleeding from the rough thread. "Yes, I can work. Then we will see how the week goes." Parker turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "For what it is worth, Miss Riley, I am sorry my father put you in this position. It was not fair to you." He left before she could respond, and Teresa sank down onto the bed, suddenly exhausted. Through the window, she could see the wheat fields glowing golden in the setting sun, and beyond them, the mountains rising dark against the sky. Somewhere in the barn, she heard the lowing of cattle, and closer by, chickens clucking in their coop. It was beautiful and lonely in equal measure, and Teresa felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time since leaving Boston. But she did not let herself cry. Instead, she unpacked her few belongings, washed her face and hands in the basin, and smoothed her hair as best she could. If she only had a week to prove herself, then she would make it count. When she emerged from her room at 6 o'clock, she found Walter and Parker already seated at the table. A pot of stew sat in the middle, with a loaf of bread beside it. The food was simple but smelled good, and Teresa realized she had not eaten since morning. "Please sit," Walter said, gesturing to one of the empty chairs. "Parker made the stew. He is actually a fair cook when he puts his mind to it." Teresa sat, and Parker passed her the ladle without comment. They ate in uncomfortable silence for several minutes before Walter attempted conversation. "We have about 40 acres of wheat ready to harvest," he said. "Normally, we would hire extra hands for the work, but with Jackson laid up and most of the available men working the mines, we are short. The wheat needs to be cut, bundled, and shocked, then we will thresh it. It is hard work, especially in this heat." "What would you like me to do?" Teresa asked. Parker looked up from his bowl, surprise flickering across his face. "You want to help in the fields?" "Your father said you needed help. I may not know much about wheat farming, but I can learn." "It is not woman's work," Parker said. "Women worked beside their husbands on every homestead I saw on my way here," Teresa replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "If you need help, I am offering it. Unless you would prefer I stay inside and do the cooking and cleaning, which will not get your wheat harvested any faster." A smile tugged at the corner of Walter's mouth, quickly suppressed. Parker stared at her for a moment longer, then gave a short nod. "We start at sunrise. Wear something you do not mind ruining. The chaff gets everywhere and the work is dirty." "I will be ready," Teresa said. The rest of the meal passed in silence, but it felt less hostile than before. After supper, Teresa insisted on washing the dishes while Walter and Parker went to check on the livestock. When she finally returned to her small room, she was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. She changed into her nightgown, said her prayers, and climbed into bed, asleep almost before her head hit the pillow. Someone knocked on her door while it was still dark outside, and Teresa jolted awake, disoriented. "Miss Riley, it is almost 5, Walter's voice called. "Parker is already in the barn." Teresa dressed quickly in her oldest work dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen her through her worst days in Boston. She braided her hair tightly and wrapped it around her head, pinning it securely. When she stepped outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, and the air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains. Parker was indeed in the barn, and she found him harnessing a large draft horse. He glanced at her briefly, taking in her work dress and sensible boots, and nodded. "The tools are in the wagon. We will start on the south field today." Walter had breakfast waiting when they went back to the house, a simple meal of bacon, eggs, and biscuits. Teresa ate quickly, aware that Parker was already finished and waiting. By the time the sun broke over the mountains, they were in the wheat field, and Parker was showing her how to use a scythe. "The key is the rhythm," he said, demonstrating the smooth, sweeping motion. "Let the blade do the work. If you fight it, you will tire yourself out in an hour. Watch." He moved through the wheat with practiced ease, the scythe whistling as it cut through the stalks. The grain fell in neat rows behind him, ready to be gathered. He made it look effortless, but when he handed the scythe to Teresa, she immediately understood how difficult it actually was. The tool was heavy, and getting the right angle and motion took concentration. Her first few attempts were clumsy, and she could feel Parker watching her, probably regretting his decision to let her help. But Teresa was nothing if not stubborn, and she kept trying, adjusting her grip and her stance until she found a rhythm that worked. "Better," Parker said after several minutes. "Keep your shoulders relaxed. You are tensing up." He moved to work several yards away with his own scythe, and for the next hour the only sounds were the swish of their blades through the wheat and the occasional call of a bird. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature began to rise. Sweat ran down Teresa's back and plastered her dress to her skin. Her shoulders and arms burned with effort, and blisters were forming on her palms despite the calluses she had developed in the textile mill. But she did not stop, and she did not complain. She focused on the rhythm, on the satisfying sound of the scythe cutting clean through the stalks, on the growing swath of fallen wheat behind her. When Parker called for a break around mid-morning, Teresa nearly collapsed with relief, but she kept her expression neutral as she joined him in the shade of the wagon. He handed her a canteen, and she drank gratefully. The water was cool and tasted faintly of metal. "You are keeping up better than I expected," Parker said. It was not exactly a compliment, but it was not an insult either. "I told you I could work. Most women from back east, they have never done anything harder than needlepoint. I figured you would last maybe an hour before giving up." "I am not most women." Teresa handed back the canteen. "How much more do we have to do today?" Parker looked out over the field, calculating. "If we keep this pace, we will finish this section by supper time. Tomorrow we will start bundling and shocking what we cut today, and cut more in the afternoon." "Shocking?" "Standing the bundles up in stacks so the grain can finish drying. It has to dry properly before threshing, or the quality suffers." They rested for 10 more minutes, then returned to work. The afternoon stretched long and hot, and Teresa's world narrowed to the rhythm of the scythe, the ache in her muscles, and the endless rows of wheat. Several times she thought about stopping, about admitting that the work was too much, but each time she glanced over and saw Parker working steadily, she forced herself to continue. By the time the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Teresa was moving on pure stubbornness. Her hands were raw inside her work gloves, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. But they had finished the section Parker wanted to complete, and when she finally stopped and straightened, she felt a surge of satisfaction at the sight of the neatly cut field. Parker walked over, studying her with an expression she could not read. "Your hands are bleeding." Teresa looked down and saw that he was right, Blood had seeped through her gloves in several places. "They will heal. We need to wrap them or they will get infected." Parker's voice was gruff. "Come on. We are done for today." The ride back to the house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Teresa was too tired to talk, and Parker seemed lost in his own thoughts. When they reached the barn, he unharnessed the horse while Teresa unloaded the tools, moving slowly and carefully to avoid jarring her screaming muscles. Inside the house, Walter took one look at her and immediately went to work heating water for washing. Parker brought out a first aid kit, and before Teresa could protest, he took her hands and began carefully removing the ruined gloves. His touch was surprisingly gentle, and he worked with the competence of someone who had treated many injuries over the years. He cleaned the worst of the blisters, applied salve, and wrapped her hands in clean bandages. "You should have said something," he said quietly. "We could have stopped. You did not stop. I have been doing this since I was 12 years old. My hands are tough as leather." Parker finished tying off the bandage and looked up at her. "You worked hard today, harder than any man I have hired in the past 3 years." It was the first real compliment he had given her, and Teresa felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the heat of the day. "Thank you. Get yourself cleaned up. I will make supper tonight." That night, Teresa fell asleep the moment she lay down, too exhausted even to undress properly. The next morning, she woke to discover that every muscle in her body had stiffened overnight, and getting out of bed required genuine effort. But when Parker knocked on her door, she called out that she would be ready in 5 minutes, and she was. They fell into a routine over the next several days. Up before dawn, quick breakfast, then out to the fields. They worked through the morning heat, broke for dinner at noon, and continued until the sun began to set. Parker showed Teresa how to bundle the cut wheat, tying the stalks with twine, and how to shock them in the standing stacks that dotted the field like small teepees. The work was back-breaking, but Teresa found a certain satisfaction in it, a sense of accomplishment that she had never felt in the textile mill or in her old life in Boston. Parker remained mostly silent while they worked, but he began to open up slightly during their breaks and at meals. Teresa learned that his mother had died when he was 15, that he had been running the ranch largely on his own since his early 20s, and that he loved this land with a fierce devotion that showed in everything he did. "My father wanted to mine like everyone else," Parker said one afternoon as they rested in the shade. "When gold was discovered in the Boise Basin, half the territory went crazy trying to strike it rich. But my mother, she convinced him to try farming instead. Said the miners would always need food and that was just as good as gold." "She was right," Teresa said. "She was. We have done well here, better than most of the miners ever did. But it is hard work, constant work, and there is never enough time or hands to do it all." "Is that why your father placed the advertisement? Because you needed help?" Parker was quiet for a long moment. "Partly. But also because I think he is lonely. He wants grandchildren, wants to see the ranch continue after we are gone. And I suppose he figured I was never going to find a wife on my own. Would he have been right about that? Probably." Parker picked up a stalk of wheat and twirled it between his fingers. "I have never been good with people, with talking and courting and all that. I know what I am, Miss Riley. I am a farmer who barely leaves his land. Not exactly what women dream about." Teresa thought about the men she had known in Boston, the smooth-talking clerks and merchants who had promised her things they never intended to deliver, who had seen her as something to use and discard. "You might be surprised what women dream about," she said softly. Parker looked at her, something uncertain in his eyes, but before he could respond, Walter called from the house that dinner was ready, and the moment passed. By the end of her first week at the ranch, they had harvested nearly half the wheat, a remarkable achievement for just 2 people. Teresa's hands had healed enough that she could work without bandages, though new calluses were forming over the old blisters. She felt stronger than she had in years, her body adapting to the physical demands of farm work. On the evening of her 7th day, as they sat down to supper, Walter cleared his throat. "Miss Riley, it has been a week. Parker and I would like to discuss your future if you are willing." Teresa set down her fork, her heart suddenly pounding. She had known this conversation was coming, but she still was not sure what she wanted the outcome to be. "All right." Walter looked at his son. "Parker." Parker shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. "You have worked harder than I had any right to expect, Miss Riley. You have been a real help and I appreciate it, but I want you to know that you are free to leave if that is what you want. My father will keep his promise about your passage back east and the money he offered." "And if I wanted to stay?" Teresa asked, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Then I would be glad to have your continued help." Parker hesitated. "As for the marriage arrangement, I will not hold you to that. It was not your idea or mine. But if you did want to stay on that basis, I would agree to it. You would have a home here, security. It would be a practical arrangement, nothing more." Teresa felt something twist in her chest. A practical arrangement. That was what her life had become. A series of practical arrangements and survival decisions. But looking at Parker across the table, at his honest face and the strength in his hands, at the way he had worked beside her without complaint or condescension, she realized she wanted more than that. "What if I wanted it to be more than practical?" she asked quietly. Parker's eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if we courted properly? What if we took time to know each other to see if this could be a real marriage, not just a business arrangement?" Teresa felt her cheeks warm but pushed on. "You have been kind to me, Mr. Preston, kinder than you had to be, and I have come to respect you this past week. I think there could be something real between us if we gave it a chance." Silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Walter was smiling, but he kept quiet, letting his son respond. Parker ran a hand through his hair, and Teresa saw that his hand was trembling slightly. "I am not good at this, Miss Riley. I do not know how to court a woman properly. I do not know what you would expect." "I do not need grand gestures or poetry," Teresa said. "I just need honesty and time. Can you give me that?" "Yes." Parker's voice was rough with emotion. "Yes, I can do that." Walter let out a breath. "Well, thank goodness that is settled. I was worried I was going to have to drag you both to the altar at gunpoint." Despite the tension, Teresa laughed, and after a moment Parker joined her. The sound transformed his face, making him look younger and less burdened, and Teresa felt her heart skip. They finished the meal in a much lighter mood, and afterward, Parker asked Teresa if she would like to walk down to the creek with him. They strolled through the dusk, the air cooling rapidly now that the sun had set. Crickets sang in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. "I have never told anyone this," Parker said as they reached the creek bank, "but sometimes I stand out here at night and wonder what my life would have been like if I had made different choices. If I had left this place when I was younger, seen more of the world." "You regret staying?" Teresa asked. "No. This land, this ranch, it is part of me. I could not leave it any more than I could cut off my own arm." Parker picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water. "But I have been lonely. I did not realize how lonely until you came. Having someone to talk to work beside, it has made me see what I was missing." Teresa moved closer to him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I was lonely too back in Boston. I felt like I was drowning in that city, like there was no air to breathe. When I saw your father's advertisement, it felt like a lifeline. I am glad you answered it." Parker turned to face her. "I know we have only known each other a week, but I feel like I can talk to you in a way I have never been able to talk to anyone. Is that strange?" "No, I feel the same way." They stood there in the growing darkness, and Teresa thought Parker might try to kiss her. But instead, he reached out and gently took her hand, mindful of her healing blisters. It was a simple gesture, almost chaste, but it sent warmth flooding through her body. "We should get back," Parker said after a moment. "Tomorrow is Sunday. We rest on Sunday, let the land rest too. Maybe I could show you more of the ranch if you would like." "I would like that very much." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and when they reached Teresa's door, Parker wished her good night with a gentleness that made her chest ache. She went to bed that night with a smile on her face and hope blooming in her heart for the first time in longer than she could remember. Sunday dawned clear and beautiful, and after breakfast, Parker saddled 2 horses. Teresa had not ridden much, but the gentle mare he chose for her was patient with her inexperience. They rode up into the foothills, following trails that Parker had known since childhood. He showed her his favorite spots: a meadow filled with wildflowers, a grove of aspen trees that would turn golden in the fall, a high ridge that offered a view of the entire valley. He told her stories about growing up on the ranch, about his mother who had loved to garden, about the hard winters and the abundant springs. Teresa shared her own stories, about her childhood in Boston, about her parents who had run a small bookshop, about the struggle after they died and her determination to survive. Parker listened intently, asking questions, and Teresa felt seen in a way she never had before. They stopped for lunch by a clear mountain stream, eating the food Walter had packed for them. The water was so cold it made Teresa's teeth ache, but it tasted pure and sweet, like nothing she had ever experienced in the city. "I want to be honest with you about something," Parker said as they rested after eating. "I am not an easy man to live with. I work too hard, and I do not always remember to talk about what I am thinking. My father says I go inside my own head and stay there for days sometimes." "Everyone has flaws, Parker. I am impatient and I can be stubborn to the point of foolishness. I also snore, or at least that is what my mother used to tell me." Parker smiled. "I snore too, apparently. My father complains about it. Then we will be well matched." They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, both tired but content. That evening, Walter played the fiddle, an instrument Teresa had not known he possessed, and the music filled the house with a warmth that went beyond the fire in the hearth. Teresa found herself swaying to the rhythm, and when Parker stood and offered his hand, she took it without hesitation. They danced clumsily in the small space, bumping into furniture and laughing. Parker was not a good dancer, but he held her carefully, and Teresa felt safe in his arms in a way she had not felt safe in years. When the dance ended, they were both breathless, and Parker's hand lingered on her waist for a moment before he stepped back. The next week brought more work in the fields. The remaining wheat needed to be harvested, and the grain they had already cut needed to be threshed. Parker brought out the threshing machine, a complicated piece of equipment that required both of them to operate. Teresa learned to feed the shocks of wheat into the machine, while Parker managed the mechanism that separated the grain from the chaff. It was hot, dusty work, and by the end of each day they were both covered in a fine layer of wheat chaff that got into their hair, their clothes, and every possible crevice. But they worked well together, developing an easy rhythm and communication that required few words. In the evenings, after supper and chores, Parker began teaching Teresa to ride better. They would take the horses out for short rides, and he showed her how to handle different gaits, how to guide the horse with subtle movements, how to read the animal's mood and energy. Teresa was a quick learner, and soon she felt comfortable enough to ride on her own. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival, they rode up to the ridge Parker had shown her before. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The wheat fields below glowed golden in the fading light, and Teresa could see smoke rising from the chimney of the house. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "It is." Parker was not looking at the view. He was looking at her. Teresa turned to meet his gaze, and something passed between them, a recognition that what had started as a practical arrangement had become something much deeper. Parker dismounted and came to help her down, his hands on her waist steady and strong. But this time, when her feet touched the ground, he did not step back. "Teresa," he said, using her first name for the first time, "may I kiss you?" "Yes." He leaned down slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but Teresa did not want to change her mind. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet, a question rather than a demand. Teresa kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and fast beneath her palms. When they finally pulled apart, Parker rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that for days. I have been wanting you to do it for days." He laughed, the sound rumbling in his chest. "We are not very good at this courting thing, are we? I think we are doing just fine." They stayed on the ridge until the stars began to appear, talking quietly and stealing occasional kisses. By the time they rode back to the ranch, Teresa felt like she was floating. Walter took one look at their faces when they came in and smiled knowingly, but he did not say anything, just wished them good night and retired to his room. Parker walked Teresa to her door, and they stood in the dim hallway for a long moment. "I know we have not known each other long," Parker said. "But I am falling in love with you, Teresa. I want you to know that." Teresa felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were happy tears. "I am falling in love with you too." Parker kissed her again, longer this time, with more confidence and passion. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathing hard. "I should let you get some rest," he said reluctantly. "Tomorrow is going to be another long day." "They are all long days," Teresa said with a smile, "but I do not mind, not anymore." The next month passed in a blur of work and growing affection. They finished the wheat harvest, and Parker declared it one of the best yields they had ever had. Some of the grain they kept for their own use, some they sold in town, and some they saved as seed for the next planting. Parker took Teresa with him when he went to sell the wheat, and she met more of the people from Idaho City, the shopkeepers and miners and other farmers who made up the small community. Several of the women in town were curious about the new Mrs. Preston, as they assumed she was, and Teresa had to explain several times that she and Parker were not yet married. But she could tell from the way Parker introduced her, with pride in his voice and his hand on her back, that it was only a matter of time. The question came on a cool September evening. They had been riding, and Parker had led her to a spot she had not seen before, a small waterfall that tumbled down a rocky cliff into a clear pool. The setting sun caught the spray, creating tiny rainbows in the mist. Parker dismounted and helped Teresa down, then took both her hands in his. "Teresa Riley, I am not a man of fancy words, and I cannot offer you a life of ease or luxury, but I can offer you my whole heart, my loyalty, and a home where you will always be loved and respected. Will you marry me?" Teresa felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. "Yes, Parker, yes, I will marry you." He pulled a simple gold band from his pocket. "It was my mother's," he said. "My father gave it to me last week. He said she would have wanted you to have it." The ring fit perfectly, and when Parker slid it onto her finger, Teresa felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she was meant to be, with this man in this wild and beautiful place. They married 2 weeks later in the small church in Idaho City, with Walter and a handful of townspeople as witnesses. Teresa wore a simple white dress that the shopkeeper's wife had helped her sew, and Parker wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous in equal measure. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Parker kissed her with such tenderness that Teresa forgot anyone else was in the room. Walter hosted a small celebration at the ranch afterward, with food and music and dancing. Several neighbors came, bringing gifts and good wishes. Teresa was overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance she received, so different from the cold anonymity of Boston. This was a real community, and she was now part of it. As the evening wound down and the guests departed, Walter embraced both of them. "Your mother would be so happy, Parker," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said you needed someone strong to stand beside you, and Teresa, you are every bit as strong as she was." "Thank you, Walter," Teresa said, kissing his weathered cheek. "Thank you for bringing me here." "Thank my stubbornness and my desperation," Walter said with a laugh, "but I am glad it worked out the way it did." Parker and Teresa walked hand in hand back to the house, which Walter had discreetly vacated for the evening, choosing to sleep in the bunkhouse. The fire was burning low in the hearth, and the house was quiet except for the crackle of the flames and the distant sound of night birds. Parker turned to Teresa, suddenly looking nervous again. "I know this is all very new, and if you need time—" Teresa silenced him with a kiss. "I do not need time, Parker. I need you." He swept her into his arms, and she laughed as he carried her to the bedroom they would now share. The room had been cleaned and aired, with fresh linens on the bed and wildflowers in a vase on the dresser. Parker set her down gently, and they came together with a passion that had been building for weeks, fueled by hard work and growing love, and the knowledge that they had chosen each other freely. Later, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Teresa traced her fingers over Parker's chest, feeling his heartbeat slow and steady beneath her palm. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she whispered. Parker kissed the top of her head. "Neither did I. I thought I would spend my life alone, married to this ranch and nothing else. But you changed everything, Teresa. You made me see what was possible." "We made it possible together," Teresa said. "You could have sent me away that first week, but you gave me a chance. You saw me for who I really was. I saw a woman who was not afraid of hard work, who did not flinch from a challenge, who made me laugh for the first time in years." Parker tightened his arms around her. "I saw the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and when Teresa woke in the pre-dawn darkness, she felt Parker's warmth beside her and knew she was truly home. The autumn passed in a golden haze of work and contentment. Teresa learned more about running the ranch, about tending the cattle and chickens, about preserving food for the winter. She and Parker worked together to winterize the buildings, to stack firewood, to prepare for the harsh Idaho winter that Walter assured her was coming. But it was not all work. Parker made sure they took time for each other, for rides up into the mountains to see the aspen leaves turn gold, for quiet evenings by the fire, for Sunday picnics by the creek. Walter often joined them, and Teresa came to love the old man like the father she had lost. He told stories about Parker's childhood, about the early days of the ranch, about Teresa's mother-in-law who she wished she could have known. In November, the first snow fell, a light dusting that turned the world white and clean. Teresa stood on the porch, marveling at the beauty when Parker came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Wait until January," he said. "This is nothing compared to what is coming." "I am not afraid," Teresa said, leaning back against him. "I have you. You do. Always." Parker rested his chin on top of her head. I have been thinking, Teresa, about the future, about what comes next. What have you been thinking? I am thinking that this house is going to need to be bigger, especially if we are going to fill it with children. Teresa turned in his arms, searching his face. Children? You want children? I want everything with you, Parker said simply. A big, noisy family, a ranch that thrives for generations, a life filled with love and hard work and purpose. Is that what you want too? Teresa thought about the lonely girl she had been in Boston, about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in August with nothing but hope and determination. She thought about all the ways her life had changed, about the love she had found in this unexpected place with this unexpected man. Yes, she said, that is exactly what I want. Winter came in earnest in December, with snowstorms that lasted for days and temperatures that plunged below zero. The ranch became a small, isolated world, cut off from town by impassable roads. But inside the house, there was warmth and light and love. Teresa learned to bake bread in the temperamental wood stove, to knit by the fire, to play checkers with Walter and Parker during the long evenings. Parker taught her to read the weather, to predict when a storm was coming by the behavior of the animals and the smell of the air. He showed her how to care for the livestock in the bitter cold, how to break ice on the water troughs, how to make sure every animal had enough feed and shelter to survive. And in the quiet moments in their bed at night or in stolen kisses throughout the day, their love deepened and grew. Teresa discovered that Parker had a wry sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed, that he loved to read and had a small collection of books he had been acquiring for years, that he sometimes woke from nightmares about losing the ranch and needed her reassurance to fall back asleep. Parker learned that Teresa loved music and would sing softly while she worked, that she was fiercely protective of the animals and cried when one of the chickens died, that she had a gift for numbers, and helped him manage the ranch accounts with a skill that impressed him. By the time spring arrived in 1879, melting the snow and turning the world green again, they had weathered their first winter together and emerged stronger for it. In April, Teresa realized her monthly bleeding had not come, and when the pattern continued into May, she knew she was pregnant. She told Parker on a warm evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. She had been nervous about his reaction, but the moment the words left her mouth, his face lit up with such joy that all her worries evaporated. A baby. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break. Teresa, are you sure? As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. But all the signs are there. Parker laughed and spun her around, then immediately set her down, looking worried. I am sorry, I should not have done that. Are you all right? Do you need to sit down? Parker, I am pregnant, not made of glass, Teresa said with a laugh. I am fine. Walter came out to see what the commotion was about, and when they told him, he whooped with delight and pulled them both into a bear hug. I am going to be a grandfather. Lord have mercy, I never thought I would see the day. They celebrated with a special supper, and Walter brought out a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. Parker had only one drink, declaring he needed to stay sharp to take care of Teresa, which made her roll her eyes but also warmed her heart. That night, as they lay in bed, Parker's hand rested gently on Teresa's still flat stomach. Do you think it will be a boy or a girl? I have no idea. Does it matter to you? Not even a little. As long as you and the baby are healthy, I do not care. Parker pressed a kiss to her temple. But I have been thinking about names. If it is a boy, I would like to name him after your father. What was his name? Teresa felt tears prick at her eyes. James. His name was James Riley, James Preston, I like that. And if it is a girl, what was your mother's name, Catherine? But everyone called her Kate. Kate Preston. Teresa said, testing the sound. "That is beautiful." The summer of 1879 was busy and productive. With Walter's help and Teresa's condition preventing her from doing the heaviest work, Parker hired 2 hands to help with the wheat harvest. The young men were respectful and hardworking, and the harvest went smoothly. The ranch prospered, and Parker was able to buy additional cattle and start planning an addition to the house. Teresa spent her days managing the household, tending the garden she had planted in the spring, and preparing for the baby's arrival. The women from town came to visit, bringing gifts and advice. She became particularly close to Martha Jenkins, the wife of the general store owner, who had 3 children of her own and was a font of practical wisdom. As Teresa's belly grew and the baby became more active, Parker became increasingly protective. He insisted she rest frequently, brought her treats from town, and talked to her stomach every night, telling the baby about the ranch and the family it would be born into. In early December, as the first snows began to fall, Teresa went into labor. Parker sent one of the hands racing to town to fetch the midwife, while Walter boiled water and gathered the supplies they had prepared. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning, but finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, a baby's cry filled the house. "It is a boy," the midwife announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant in Teresa's arms. "A strong, healthy boy." Teresa looked down at her son, at his tiny, perfect features and his shock of dark hair, and felt love explode in her chest like nothing she had ever experienced. Parker knelt beside the bed, tears streaming openly down his face as he touched his son's hand with one careful finger. "James," Teresa whispered. "His name is James Parker Preston. He is perfect," Parker said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are perfect. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you for giving me this." Walter came in to meet his grandson, and the old man's face crumpled with joy when Teresa placed the baby in his arms. "Hello there, little one," he said softly. "Welcome to the Preston Ranch. You are going to love it here." The winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and precious moments. James was a good baby, but he was still a baby, demanding frequent feeding and constant attention. Teresa was exhausted but happier than she had ever been. Parker was a devoted father, walking the floor with James when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint, and singing lullabies in his deep, slightly off-key voice. By the spring of 1880, Teresa had recovered from the birth, and life settled into a new rhythm. The wheat was planted, the cattle were tended, and James grew bigger and stronger every day. Parker expanded the house as planned, adding 2 new bedrooms and a larger kitchen. On an evening in late August, almost exactly 2 years after Teresa had arrived in Idaho City, she and Parker stood in the wheat field, watching the grain wave in the breeze. James slept in a basket at their feet, and Walter was visible in the distance, working in the garden. "Do you remember the first time we stood in this field together?" Parker asked, his arm around Teresa's waist. "I remember thinking I might die from exhaustion before the day was over," Teresa said with a laugh. "My hands were bleeding and every muscle in my body hurt, but you did not give up." "You never gave up." Parker turned her to face him. "I fell in love with you during that first week, you know, watching you work so hard, refusing to quit even when I could see how much it hurt. I knew then that you were the strongest person I had ever met." "I fell in love with you too," Teresa said. "You treated me with respect when you could have sent me away. You gave me a chance to prove myself, and you saw me as a partner, not just a woman who needed to be protected and sheltered. You are my partner, Teresa, in every way. This ranch, this life, I could not do it without you." Teresa looked around at the wheat field, at the house where their son slept, at the mountains rising in the distance. She thought about the frightened, desperate woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 2 years ago and the strong, confident woman she had become. "I love you, Parker Preston," she said. "I love the life we have built together. And I love you, Teresa Preston, more than words can say." James chose that moment to wake with a cry, and they both laughed. Parker picked up the basket and started back toward the house, with Teresa walking beside him. The wheat rustled behind them, golden and heavy, a promise of plenty in the months to come. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. In 1881, Teresa gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Catherine after Parker's mother. Kate, as they called her, had her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's dark hair, and she was a spirited child from the moment she entered the world. The ranch continued to prosper. Parker's hard work and Teresa's business acumen made them one of the most successful farming operations in the region. They hired more permanent help, good men who became like family, and the wheat harvests were consistently strong. James and Kate grew up working beside their parents, learning the rhythms of ranch life from the time they could walk. James was quiet and thoughtful like his grandfather Walter, while Kate was bold and adventurous, always testing boundaries and finding new ways to get into trouble. Walter remained active and engaged with the ranch until his health began to fail in 1885. He died peacefully in his sleep one night in the autumn, and they buried him on a hill overlooking the wheat fields he had loved. Parker grieved deeply for his father, but he found comfort in knowing that Walter had seen the ranch thrive and had been surrounded by family in his final years. Teresa gave birth to a third child in 1886, another boy they named William. By then, the house had been expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and the ranch had taken on the feel of a true homestead, busy and alive with activity. On a warm summer evening in 1890, 12 years after Teresa had first arrived in Idaho City, the family gathered on the porch after supper. James, now 10, was teaching William, who was 4, to whittle. Kate, who was 8, was reading aloud from a book while Teresa mended clothes and Parker cleaned his rifle. "You ever miss Boston?" Kate asked suddenly, looking up from her book. "Did you have adventures there?" Teresa considered the question carefully. "I lived in Boston, but I do not think I ever really had a home there, not the way I have a home here." "Tell us the story again," James said, "about how you and Papa met." It was a story they never tired of hearing, and Teresa shared a smile with Parker before beginning. She told them about the stagecoach ride, about their first awkward meeting, about working in the wheat fields until her hands bled. She told them about falling in love slowly, like wheat growing, steady and strong and sure. "And then what happened?" William asked, even though he had heard the story dozens of times. "And then we got married and had you rascals," Parker said, ruffling William's hair. "Best decision I ever made." "Papa's decision or getting married?" Kate asked with a grin. "Both," Parker and Teresa said together, and everyone laughed. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Parker and Teresa took a walk down to the creek, as they still did whenever the weather was fine. The moon was bright, turning the wheat fields silver, and the air was warm and sweet with the smell of growing things. "We have been married 11 years, Teresa said, leaning against Parker's shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like no time at all." "Do you have any regrets?" Parker asked. "Not a single one. This life with you, with our children, it is more than I ever dreamed possible." Teresa turned to look up at him. "What about you? Do you regret your father's scheme to bring me here?" Parker laughed. "I was angry at the time, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me. You saved me, Teresa. I was so focused on survival, on just getting through each day, that I had forgotten how to live. You taught me what it meant to have a real home, a real family." "We taught each other," Teresa said. "I was lost when I came here, broken by grief and poverty and fear. You gave me a place to belong, work that mattered, love that healed me." They stood by the creek for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the water flow over the rocks and the night sounds of the ranch. Above them, the stars shone bright and clear, countless points of light in the vast western sky. The years continued to pass, marked by the seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. The children grew older and more capable, taking on more responsibilities and developing their own dreams and passions. James became an expert horseman and cattleman, while Kate developed a gift for growing things and took over management of the large garden that now fed the family and provided surplus for sale in town. William, the youngest, showed an aptitude for mechanics and was fascinated by the new farming equipment that was becoming available. In 1895, Teresa was surprised to discover she was pregnant again at the age of 39. The pregnancy was harder than her previous ones, and Parker worried constantly. But in the spring of 1896, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl they named Margaret, after Teresa's mother. "Our surprise blessing," Parker called her, and indeed Margaret seemed to be a gift that brought new joy to the family. Her older siblings doted on her, and Teresa found herself cherishing every moment, knowing this would likely be her last child. By the turn of the century, the Preston Ranch was one of the most respected operations in Idaho. The railroad had come to the region, making it easier to transport their wheat to larger markets, and new farming technologies increased their productivity. But despite their prosperity, Parker and Teresa never forgot the hard work and determination that had built their success. They made a point to help their neighbors when times were tough, to hire men who needed work, to support the church and the school in Idaho City. Teresa, in particular, became known for her generosity, always ready with a meal for a hungry family or advice for a new bride struggling to adapt to life in the West. One evening in 1903, as they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. James, now 23 and courting a girl from a neighboring ranch, gave a toast that brought tears to Teresa's eyes. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love is not just words but actions. Who showed us that a good marriage is built on respect, hard work, and partnership. Who created a home filled with love and laughter and purpose. May we all be lucky enough to find what they have found together." Everyone cheered and drank, and Parker pulled Teresa into his arms for a kiss that made their children groan and laugh. But Teresa did not care. After 25 years, Parker's kisses still made her heart race, still made her feel like the young woman who had fallen in love in a wheat field. As the party wound down and the guests departed, Teresa and Parker stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, looking out over their land. The wheat fields stretched golden in the fading light, just as they had that first summer. But now there were orchards too, and a larger barn and a bunkhouse for the hired hands, and all the markers of a thriving, successful operation. 25 years, Parker said softly. "It has gone by so fast. And yet we have accomplished so much," Teresa replied. "Look at what we built together, Parker. Not just the ranch, but our family, our life. We started with nothing but hope and determination, and look where we are now." "We started with love," Parker corrected gently. "Maybe we did not know it at first, but it was always there, growing like wheat." Quiet and steady and strong, Teresa smiled at the metaphor. "Love grew like wheat," she repeated. "I like that. It is the truth. We planted something that first summer, Teresa, when we worked side by side in these fields. We watered it with our sweat and our tears. We tended it carefully, protected it from the storms, and it grew into something beautiful and enduring. He took her hand, and Teresa felt the familiar roughness of his calluses against her palm, marks of a lifetime of hard work. Her own hands were just as work-worn, just as strong. They were the hands of people who had built something real and lasting together. The years that followed were kinder and easier, as the children took over more of the ranch work, and Parker and Teresa could step back slightly from the daily grind. They took trips to Boise and even once to San Francisco, seeing more of the world together. But they always returned to the ranch with relief, knowing it was where they truly belonged. James married his sweetheart in 1905 and brought her to live on the ranch, where they built a house on the northern edge of the property. Within a year, Teresa was a grandmother, a role she embraced with joy and enthusiasm. Kate married a teacher from Idaho City and moved to town, though she visited the ranch frequently. William, showing his mechanical skills, opened a shop in town repairing farm equipment, but he too remained closely connected to the family. Only Margaret, the youngest, still lived at home, though as she grew into a beautiful and spirited young woman, Teresa knew it was only a matter of time before she too would leave to build her own life. On a quiet evening in 1908, 30 years after Teresa had first arrived in Idaho City, she and Parker sat together on their porch as they had done countless times before. Parker was now 56, his hair fully gray but his body still strong from years of physical work. Teresa was 52, with silver threads in her dark hair and fine lines around her eyes, marks of a life lived fully. "You remember what I told you the day you arrived?" Parker asked suddenly. "I told you I was not good with people, with talking and courting. I said I was just a farmer who barely left his land." "I remember," Teresa said. "I was wrong. Well, partly wrong. I am still not good at fancy words, and I am still a farmer who barely leaves his land, but I was wrong to think that was not enough. Because it was enough for you and you were enough for me, and together we built something extraordinary." Teresa felt tears prick at her eyes. After all these years, Parker could still surprise her with his words, still make her feel cherished and loved. "You were always enough, Parker. More than enough. You gave me a home when I had none, a purpose when I felt lost, and a love that has sustained me through every challenge. You are the best man I have ever known, and I thank God every day for your father's scheming and determination." Parker laughed. "I wish he could see us now. See his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. See how the ranch has thrived." "I think he can see," Teresa said softly, "and I think he is proud." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The wheat fields, soon to be harvested again, glowed in the fading light. From the barn, they could hear one of the hands singing as he finished the evening chores. Closer by, Margaret was practicing piano in the parlor, the music drifting through the open windows. It was an ordinary evening on the Preston ranch, and it was perfect. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Parker pulled Teresa close. "Do you know what the best part of all this is?" he asked. "Tell me. I get to spend every day with you. 30 years together, and I still look forward to seeing your face every morning. I still reach for you in the night. I still love you more with each passing year. I love you too, Parker, with everything I am." They kissed, and it was sweet and familiar and filled with the depth of feeling that came from decades of shared life. When they finally pulled apart, Teresa rested her head on Parker's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his body against hers. "We had quite a harvest, did we not?" she murmured. "The wheat. It was a good year. No, I mean us. We harvested more than wheat these past 30 years. We harvested love, family, a life rich with meaning and purpose." Parker pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We did indeed. And the growing season is not over yet, my love. We have many more years ahead of us." And they did. Parker and Teresa Preston lived long, full lives, watching their children grow and thrive, welcoming more grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren into their family. The ranch continued to prosper, adapted to changing times and new technologies, but always maintaining the values and work ethic that Teresa and Parker had established together. When they finally passed, Teresa at 81 and Parker at 85, they were buried side by side on the hill overlooking the wheat fields where their love had first grown. Their children and grandchildren gathered to remember them, sharing stories about their dedication to each other, their strength, their kindness, and the legacy of love they had created. The Preston Ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to what two people could build when they worked together with determination and love. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings, when the wheat turned golden in the fading light, the descendants who still worked the land would swear they could feel the presence of their ancestors, Teresa and Parker, watching over the fields they had loved, their love enduring like the land itself, eternal and strong and true. The mail-order bride who had come during harvest season, who had worked beside the cowboy until love grew like wheat, had found her home. And in finding it, she had created something that would last far beyond her own lifetime, a legacy of love and hard work and faith that the best things in life were worth fighting for, worth working for, and worth building together, one day at a time, one season at a time, until death and beyond.